So investigative reporting. I always think that if you meet a reporter who says, I'm not an ordinary reporter, I'm an investigative reporter, you're almost certainly dealing with somebody who has quite a significant personality problem. The point being, he's bigging himself up. It's like trying to say, this water is special, it's wet. This air is special, it has oxygen. My point is, all reporting is investigative because all reporting is an attempt to get at the truth. I'm very unhappy, therefore, with that expression. So I want to make that point at the beginning about the importance of truth-telling. I always think if you take any profession, you could say each profession has a kind of defining ethic. So if you were a diplomat, for example, you're allowed to lie and cheat and steal, but you have to be loyal to your government. Loyalty is your defining ethic. And with us, it's honesty, the attempt to tell the truth, absolutely fundamental. Now, the reason I want to put that out there is because those of you who've battled through my book will be aware that I think truth-telling reporting is in a state of great jeopardy. And there are various reasons for that, but the primary one is to do with the impact of the corporate owners who have taken over so many news organizations. And essentially what they've done is to inject the logic of corporate commercialism into our newsrooms in a way which has tended to kill off the logic of journalism. So truth-telling has become much more difficult in these corporate-owned news organizations. Partly this is a structural thing where they've tended to reduce editorial staffing and increased our output so we no longer have the time to do our job properly. But it also infiltrates the way that reporters think about their work in all sorts of invisible and very insidious ways, which I've gone into in the book. But what I want to just start with is that you see how drunk I am? No, not drunk, hungover. That tension between truth-telling reporting and commercialism, that tension is central, I think, to the practice of reporting all across the developed world. And against that background, what I want to talk about are the current conventions of reporting. Now, if, like me, you were trained formally at any stage as reporters, you will have been given various golden rules. So I was told, for example, you should always read all the newspapers and listen to the bulletins. Is this microphone picking me up okay? Yeah? You should always be objective. You should always give both sides of the story. Now, I want to say if you take those three rather popular golden rules, they're not just weak, they're not just bad, they are actively obstructive of effective truth-telling reporting. And it, to use a colloquial expression, pisses me off that so many young journalists now are instructed to behave in that way. Because whatever the historic origin of those golden rules, the fact is that they fit in very, very neatly with this world of corporate-owned news organizations, with what I was calling in the book churnalism, where instead of going out and trying to find the truth, we simply recycle second-hand copy, usually unchecked, from wire agencies and PR offices. And out it goes, who knows whether it's important, who knows whether it's true. These golden rules are part of that, so they're not part of the way we should be behaving. Okay, so I want to just fill the next half an hour or so by going through those three golden rules and trying to demolish them, at least to my satisfaction, if not yours. Okay, so the first one is rather simple. The idea that we should read all these other newspapers and listen to the bulletins. I think there are two problems with that. The first is that the world is full of mediocre reporters doing their job not particularly well, just kind of turning over. And there is a real danger that if we ingest too much of their output, we start to copy their technique and think that their mediocre way of doing things is correct, something we should aim for. So in the world of broadcasting in this country, there's a particularly striking example of that, where over and over again you'll find on-air reporters in radio and television speak in this extraordinary rhythm. Nobody knows why they do it, but they do. And I think the explanation for this has something to do with Alan Wicker, who in the old days of flickery black and white television was like God descended to earth. And Wicker speaks to his wife that way at breakfast. And because he does it, oh, that's the way to do it. So it's flowed down through the generations. Nobody even questions it. And of course, once you start to notice it, you want to kill the people who are doing it. In the world of print reporting, a more serious example of this mediocre technique becoming established as the objective is the use of quotes. I would argue, most people would disagree with me, but I'd like to think I'm right, that if our job is to tell the truth, we should try to construct our stories and our scripts out of statements of fact. That's what we're trying to do. If we can't achieve that, by all means, then let's fall back on telling our readers and viewers and listeners what other people are saying is the truth, because we haven't been able to get to the goal. Nowadays, what's happened is that the idea that you should construct stories out of quotes has become so dominant that if you put in a story, even to a sophisticated news desk like The Guardian, if you put in a story that doesn't have quotes in it, they throw it back at you. Where are the quotes? That's like saying this story's too good. It's built out of statements of fact. What a nonsense. So be very, very careful of adopting other people's technique and thinking it's right. The other problem, it seems to me, with ingesting masses of media output, which is even more serious, much more serious, is that you get sucked into what you might call a consensus view of the world, where because everybody else is telling these particular stories with these particular angles and sources and language and pictures, you think that's what you should be doing too. And if what we're trying to do is to tell the truth, the very worst thing you could do is to start off with a preset cluster of preconceptions about what you should be doing. That's a bad, bad starting point. So this business of the consensus account of the world, I want to come back to in a minute. But just my opinion is, you may reject it. You'll go away and make your own judgment. I personally have become a kind of media hermit. So I read The Guardian each day because I work for it, and it's kind of impolite not to read it, and sometimes I have my own stuff in there. Okay, the rest of it I ignore. I don't pick up any broadcast bulletins at all. I don't read other newspapers at all. I don't want to know how they're doing their jobs. I don't want to know what they're saying about the world, because you know, one of the things that's important to reporters, we're difficult people. Good reporters tend to have bad relationships with their bosses because we're rebellious and awkward. We don't like it when governments tell us what to do. We don't like being told what to think. And so we shouldn't be copying all these other people. Be rebels, be difficult is my advice to you. Okay, so that's about ingesting too much media output. The second point, which is longer and more complicated, but I think terribly important, is this idea that we should be objective. Now, there are two different lines of attack on that. The first is the one that's put forward by Martin Bell, the war correspondent, he of the white suit from the BBC. And what he's saying is that there are some stories which have an inherent emotional content, which is so powerful that if you don't express it deliberately and overtly in your work, then you're distorting your subject, right? So emotion is part of some stories. So he's saying, I mean, the story that made him come to that conclusion was the war in former Yugoslavia, where one side are systematically raping, murdering, ethnically cleansing the other, and if you stand there and talk like a speak-your-weight machine without feeling angry at what's going on, without expressing the misery of those people, you are distorting the story. You might say another example would be if you're doing the backgrounder at the end of a trial of a paedophile who's been running around abducting and raping and murdering children. That has an emotional content so powerful that to fail to express it is to distort the material. So what Martin is proposing is what he calls the journalism of attachment. You should be able to get in there, take sides, and express emotion. I agree with him. Matter of judgment for you. But I think there's something much more important to be said about the wrongness of the concept of objectivity, which is not just that on some occasions it's undesirable, but that on all occasions it's utterly impossible. This is a myth, this idea of objectivity. There never has been and never will be, because there never could be, an objective news story. It's a nonsense and a dangerous one. And just at the risk of getting a bit highfalutin, hang on, I need some water. I have to make a sort of slightly philosophical point here. So I'm not denying that, even hungover as I am, I know that reality continues to exist out there. There it is, real, there's Gavin. He's objective. But I think it's like, if you imagine any human being at any point approaches this reality, you might visualize it, I sometimes do, as this kind of huge, seething bramble bush, this constantly moving complex of event and process and history and projection and thought. It's all there, it's seething away. Anytime any human being approaches this and says, okay, I'm going to record some of this as a novel or a statue or a poem or a photograph or a news story, that human being necessarily and always has to make selective judgments. I'm going to go to this little piece of the reality. With the business of reporting, it's basically three, isn't it? I'm going to choose this subject to write a story about, not all the others. I'm going to take this angle into that subject. I'm going to use this language. There's other stuff about the prominence in the newspaper or the bulletin. All of these selective judgments are unavoidable. And the important thing is this: if you don't recognize that those selective judgments are part of what we do, what you over and over again get dragged into is that consensus account of the world, in which you recycle falsehood and distortion and propaganda, because you think that's the objective truth, just because that's what everybody else is saying. But it ain't. If it's false or distorted, it's no kind of truth at all. Even if it's true, over and over again, you'll find there are far more important things to be said. So I want to dwell on this because I think this is fundamental to a lot of what's happening in the world of journalism and bad reporting. So just to underline the point, there are some people who would say, do you mind if I strip off? A photographer surely is recording objectively what's happening in the world. But if you think it through, supposing a photographer walks into this building today, immediately, a selective judgment, and then into this room, another one. And here comes the photographer. Okay, now he's chosen this room. What's the objective picture of this room? Is it from the front or the back? Of all of us, or just me, or some of us? Is it in color or in black and white? And with what lighting? And from what height? And from what angle? It's full of selective judgments, and it's the same with reporting. So if you think, first of all, about that first selective judgment, which is what story are we going to cover? In this book, Flat Earth News, we did a whole lot of number crunching on stories that are put out by the quality press and broadcast bulletins. And one of the things we found was that the number of stories that are carried by individual newspapers varies. This is UK home news stories, from about 18 in a small, physically small paper like The Independent, up to about 36 in a newspaper like The Times that has more pages, or the Daily Mail, okay? And if you put the stories that the quality newspapers and the Daily Mail are carrying side by side, you find an overlap. So that in total, Fleet Street newspapers are covering about 70 stories about the UK and what happened in the previous 24 hours. And if you compare that to the output of the broadcast bulletins, BBC and commercial, you'll find a huge overlap. The broadcast bulletins, we found out that 50% of what they put out in the evening has already been in the Fleet Street papers. A further 40% will be in Fleet Street's papers tomorrow. There's 10% which is unique to broadcast, and usually that's television stories with quirky pictures. Right? So basically, our coverage of the UK amounts to running 70 stories. Now, you set those 70 stories against the totality of everything that happened in the UK in the previous 24 hours. All of that central government activity, all of the police, schools, education, local authorities, charities, trade unions, all of the death and romance and sex and screw-up, everything that went on out there. And we say these 70 stories are an objective account of what happened in the UK. It's a joke. How could we possibly be claiming that? It's highly, highly selective. And then when you come to the next selective judgment, about angles, supposing for some daft reason you decided to do a story about me, what's the truth about me? The truth is there are multiple truths. I would think there are countless truths. If you worked for a financial magazine, you'd come and you could take apart the state of my finances. You could narrow it down, look at my mortgage history, my tax history. If you came from a health magazine, you could look at my physical health generally, or the health of any part of my body. You could look at my dental health. You could look at me as a single parent, as a guy who likes watching cricket, as a journalist, as a freelance journalist. There are numerous angles, all of which would be true. And you have to choose. And then outside those numerous angles, there are falsehoods. If you write a story that says Nick Davis is an oven-ready turkey, that's what we call false. Don't want it in the paper. But within the realm of truth, there are these multiples. And just to explain to you why this is so important, if you look at a story, for example, like asylum and immigration, the history of the recent coverage of that story is that it's been driven by the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail is the most powerful newspaper in this country because it has the biggest staff. It's the newspaper that is most likely to go out and dig up a story that nobody else is covering and or an angle that nobody else is covering. Okay, they originally set off making asylum and immigration a story. They're the people who ran the whole bogus asylum seeker business. They have a group of readers who are lower middle class, who have a particular antipathy to the idea that anybody would come to this country and get public services which they have not paid for, right? So they're very hostile to migrants because they're getting something for nothing. Lower middle class people who are short of cash and self-employed really hate that. So the Daily Mail, for commercial reason, feeds them an angle which they want. And therefore, for this reason, the whole coverage, the recent sort of 10 or 15-year coverage of asylum and migration sets off on that very, very hostile angle. That angle is true. It is true that if you are born and grown up in another country and then you come here, you will not have paid for the services the public services which you use, right? So it's true, but it's a particular angle. Fleet Street now covers asylum and migration as though that were the objective truth about them. So when the figures coming out show that the amount of migration has increased, that's bad news. Right? The government was in trouble yesterday because migrant figures have gone up. It is equally true to say that when these migrants come here, we rip off their country of origin to a quite extraordinary degree. So the National Health Service, for example, more or less runs on people who've been educated all the way through to university level and in the specialist areas of medicine to be nurses or doctors. A country like Sri Lanka is probably spending £250,000 per head, and then they come over here and work in the NHS for free. What a rip-off. What a fantastic bonus. But we're not reporting that because we've got stuck into the Daily Mail angle as though that was the objective truth. And all those reporters moving around like bloody sheep, failing to understand that there are other angles there which are also true, which they should be picking up on. Do you see why it's important? So we get trapped into these selective judgments. Now, if I was talking to you 20 or 30 years ago, you might be relieved to know, that would be the end of it. I could sit down and say, just go out there and make your own judgment. Be rebels. What